Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the podcast. Today we have Danielle Mikaelian, who is a third year law school student. She has had over a decade of college admissions consulting. And so today's topic for our listeners, and perhaps for those students that are interested in pursuing an education at one of the best schools in the country, is college admissions. Danielle, welcome.
Thank you.
All right, so we'll just dive right in. College admissions 2024, it is now more competitive than ever. You have Ivy League schools with admissions rates, in the low single digits now, when maybe a decade ago, I think they were still in the high teens. So it's more competitive than ever. Can you give us kind of an insight into the college admissions process and for students thinking about applying, or those thinking about transferring or applying for a competitive graduate school? What does it look like for you as somebody who's had this insight into helping many students get into some of the best schools in the country? What does that look like now?
I think it does continue to get increasingly competitive. And as a result, you're really trying to stand out with your own personal narrative. But for a lot of students, what they don't realize is to craft a compelling narrative for admissions officers, you have to finalize what major you want to apply early enough in your high school process. Unfortunately, we're seeing a trend away from the days where you could apply undecided. And these schools increasingly want to see, okay, this person's going to be a math major. How have they displayed that interest? And this is how we're going to fit them in our student body if we ultimately admit them. So I think you're really seeing a trend towards that, which makes it increasingly hard for students because they're in high school. And obviously, it does take a little time to figure out what your eventual interest area is. But colleges have these very high expectations and they want to see that clear narrative early on.
So we'll just dive into a segment. Let's say, well, how do you go about, let's say you had all the time in the world was a candidate. Let's say you start in middle school, or even like if you're early enough, a parent approaches you. How do you craft a perfect Ivy League candidate? Assuming the student that is what they want and they're pursuing that, what would you want them to do going into high school, perhaps to make them to find themselves to be worthy and to be competitive for a slot?
First of all, we would be finalizing the major that they intend to apply with as early as possible. And even if they ultimately want to change that major down the line, this again is just giving us a foundation through which we can then create a story. And that story could be, okay, I want to be an English major. So then I ended up joining the literary magazine at my high school. I ended up submitting to some writing competitions. I ended up working at a publishing company. And I actually did a lot of those things in my own college admissions process when I was applying as an English major to schools like Columbia, where I ultimately matriculated. So it's something like that to just lay an early foundation. Obviously, on top of that, you need the grades, you need the scores, but you really want to show one clear area of focus. And then outside of that, you want to also show that you have additional areas of interest, whether that might be some side hobbies, or maybe you're also in the top band at school. Maybe you're really involved in some community service extracurriculars. Maybe you're very involved in a cultural organization or a club. But they do want to see that well rounded aspect of any aspiring applicant on top of that really straightforward area of focus that you want to just continue building upon. And whatever it is should just support you being a very compelling candidate for them to admit within a certain major.
And what's like the most common, perhaps in nowadays, the most common misunderstandings about the college admissions process? What are some traps that maybe some people fall into when they're preparing for college applications?
I think for one, there are some very attractive majors that a lot of students end up choosing when they're applying that again, they haven't necessarily built that story around. A lot of parents and their children, they think of things like pre-med or computer science as these paths to success. When you're going into the college admissions process, you might say, okay, it would be really great for you to apply for computer science, and maybe you've taken that class at school, but you have this other student applying against you who's been coding for years, has developed a lot of different applications, and has a lot of success in that field. And ultimately, you're not setting yourself up for success in the admissions process itself by going for those very popular majors that you don't necessarily have a track record in.
Yeah. One of the other kind of things I remember from my days, some of the advice given was you need to be a holistic applicant. You need to be well rounded, do a sport, do music, do, study a lot of things. Would you say that is a mistake, or do you think that is something people should be pursuing? Or in what ways can that be pursued effectively if it is not a mistake?
You do overall want to be well-rounded, but what colleges nowadays are really looking for is something that admissions counselors often call a spike. So you really want that predominant area of focus around a certain major or area of interest. And then beyond that, yeah, show you're well-rounded to the extent you can while also having the top grades, the top scores. But if it was the decision between, okay, I'm going to do a lot of different things or I'm solely going to focus on robotics throughout all of high school, win a ton of competitions, and then write about that, I would always say you go the robotics route
Mm,
and you really maintain that area of focus.
got it. Well, diving into a little bit more on my end, diving a little bit more into the extracurriculars, like how much does that actually impact the student's application process? Do they like there's so many people doing I'm doing all these things. Is it better to focus on one or two or a handful, or what is the right amount there for people to really kind of find the most impactful forward?
There's not a right amount as much as it's really, again, showing that you're overall well-rounded with a spike. What I will say is looking to things like the common application, you see 10 slots for extracurricular activities.
Right.
Typically advise if you're going for selective colleges that you want the majority of those slots filled. However,
Mm,
it depends what you're filling them with. If you're a member of 10 different clubs at your school that you signed up for during the club fair, that is not going to put you on as successful of a track as someone who was only doing 3 extracurriculars, but they took hours and hours of time and somehow this student also founded a nonprofit initiative on the side that's been receiving numerous accolades and so on. So it really depends on the typical student and what they're doing across those 10 categories and those 10 spots. You
mhm.
definitely want to show a track record of significant involvement over just, filling things up by saying, okay, I was a member of X club and this club and so on.
Sure. And now you've started this, I believe, back in the mid 2010s, right? Right around you when you yourself started at Columbia University.
So I started at Columbia in 2017. So I would say 2017 was when I ultimately started admissions consulting because once I had gained admission to a school like Columbia, it went from there. I actually found my first clients off of Reddit and I started working with them, doing everything from just revising essays to helping them finalize college lists and so on. And it just took off from there. And at this point, I've really lost track of how many students I've helped with their application journeys. It's definitely in the hundreds, if not, maybe even 1,000 at this point, if you can't how many students I've at least, edited the essays of, but in a very fulfilling role to be in, being a part of so many students' application journeys.
Yeah, that's definitely. I mean, that's 8 years of solid, helping a lot of students with their applications, and it's very entrepreneurial to start that off of Reddit and finding clients for what you see. I guess nowadays we had this big change with perhaps the Supreme Court case in the last, I believe, 2 years ago, where basically there was kind of a rebuff of the college admissions process as it previously perhaps was. So have you seen in the last 2 years, in your admissions, like how that might have impacted college admissions process or how students' applications are seen? What has been the biggest things you've seen perhaps?
I think when I'm personally consulting clients that I have not seen much of a personal change just because I am not internally at the
Hmm.
office. I will say overall that I have seen just general data points and general like news articles stating how we're seeing an overall decline in diversity within the entering classes at different schools. I know that is the case at Harvard Law School, but I would say personally, as someone consulting individual clients, I haven't seen as much of a shift in what's happening.
Yeah, of course, it's not like, macro level, micro level data, of course, and so, of course, you wouldn't necessarily see that at an individual level basis. One of the key things emphasized there was also kind of standardized testing, as a key, and during the COVID era, a lot of that was waived as temporarily, you don't need to submit that, and now a lot of schools are bringing that back. How important is really, an SAT score, an ACT score to the application itself, pending, all else in your application?
I always tell clients, and I believe this has been the perspective of various companies I've worked with as well, that you are putting yourself at a disadvantage not submitting a test score, even if it's optional. And the reason that's the case is that's like the one hard piece of data colleges have where you can prove that you are attaining this score that puts you in X percentile across the board compared to so many students in the country. It's very hard when you're looking at different schools and their grades and different GPAs to really know what that means across different states, different schools. And from an admissions officer's perspective, if you're sending in like a 34 on the ACT, that's a very compelling point of da- information slash data saying, oh, okay, this actually is a really competitive applicant. At the same time, if you're not able to achieve that score that you're trying to achieve, definitely hold back on it. I will say we are seeing schools continue to make that optional requirement not optional again. So I think we're seeing a trend towards requiring those scores in the long run.
Yeah, absolutely. Is there any difference from what you've seen with clients for the ACT or SAT? Is there a preference? I took the ACT myself. Which one matters, or which one, why, the fact that there is two standardized tests, like why is there two, and why do you think, like, what is the difference between the two of them for maybe a student to take one versus the other?
I would say that there's no difference in how the admissions officers view the SAT versus the ACT. However, just over time, I have seen typically the students who do a little better on the ACT are usually stronger in math slash science, whereas if you're more humanities oriented, you do want to lean more towards the SAT. And the reason that is because the ACT actually has a science section that the SAT fully lacks. But when it comes to just debating which test you want to take, I usually advise that students take a practice test just blindly for the ACT and the SAT and just see what they're naturally scoring higher on and then go from there.
I agree. I did much better on the ACT myself, so I went with that. All right. Well, tell us a little bit more about how you've kind of like continued this. You started out as a freshman at Columbia. You started doing this. How have that scaled up? And you worked for various companies since. But how did you feel you wanted to take this path of college admissions consulting, and the fact that you've done it now for nearly a decade? Why did you choose to continue that beyond college? And what has that looked like for you?
For me, when I was navigating the college admissions process, I just found myself gravitating to these online forums for hours and hours and hours as I was trying to figure out the college admissions process and what you need to do to gain admission to very selective schools. And at the time, I was at a very competitive public high school in California. I was in a grade of 700 students, and a lot of us had those same stats and really high goals for ourselves. So it was a competitive environment to be in where you kept asking yourself, like, how do I differentiate myself? And having been successfully able to navigate that and gain admission to so many institutions and just having the feeling of joy that came when I saw the Columbia acceptance on my portal, I really just wanted to use that knowledge and pass it on to others because I now recognize how much easier and more less stressful the process can be if you have that right mentor. I went into college, I was like, I really want to pass on this knowledge I've gained. And it was just so fulfilling being part of all of these students' journeys and getting those emails from them or the text messages saying, hey, Danielle, because of you, I get to go to my dream school. And it's one of the best feelings in the world to me. So I have absolutely loved being a part of so many students' college admissions journeys. It's one of the most fulfilling things I feel like I can do. And it really is setting someone up for success. You're giving them the next 4 years of their life. You're giving them an alumni network. You're helping influence their trajectory. You're helping them probably gain professional connections through which they can gain a job someday. So I really do feel like it's a way to give back.
Definitely. But beyond doing that in college, you're now doing something even more challenging. You're at Harvard Law School, which you started in 2022. You graduated undergrad in 2021, in the midst of COVID. And you're still doing that now, a bit of college admissions and other admissions advising sense. How have you juggled and balanced both, I think, of course, the importance of providing a quality service to your clients for college admissions, and was your own legal studies? How have you managed that, both of those? I would say, and it's really 1L for a lot of those that are interested in law school is the most important year. Getting a high GPA for a competitive place at a law firm.
I think that some of my 1L classmates probably thought I was crazy for continuing to work part time in college admissions during law school. I've been doing this again all throughout law school, all 3 years, including that first year where people barely have time to breathe. I think, again, what it comes down to is that this is just an industry that has given me so much joy and fulfillment. And for me, despite the rigorous workload of Harvard Law School, it's actually been very healthy to step outside the law school bubble at times and connect with high schoolers across the country as I'm guiding them through these difficult and stressful processes. So for me, it's what they say. If you're really enjoying something, it doesn't feel like work and you're going to find the time to do it. Sure, did I have to juggle readings and outlining and prepping for exams while also like blocking off time to meet with clients? Of course. But it really just depends where your priorities are. And for me, again, I've just gained so much fulfillment through aiding people through these processes where it has been well worth all those time management skills and all the I don't know, bar reviews I've had to skip. I haven't had to skip that many bar reviews, but you get my point.
Well, let's talk a little bit about, of course, law school as well. You've helped, of course, students get into college, but you've also kind of helped some people for their law school applications process as well, right?
Yes.
Tell us a little bit about, I guess, for law school and for broadly graduate school. It's a much smaller population, but definitely very competitive to also get into an elite law school, such as, of course, Harvard Law, Yale Law, Stanford Law, others in the top 14, which are known as the best, the T4. So the top 14 law schools has been kind of an aspirational goal for many people who is in college now, perhaps some at a great college, some at maybe college that isn't quite as up there as a Columbia University. What should they be thinking about in terms of preparing for the LSAT, for law school applications, in order to be a ultimately competitive applicant for a great law school?
First of all, I would say that it really does not matter what tier your undergraduate institution is in. If anything, it actually can be an advantage coming from a less represented school because the admissions offices at places like Harvard, Yale, Stanford, et cetera, they all take that into account while admitting people. And they actually like to see a diversity in schools represented. And to that point, they always publish a list of schools that people are coming from, different undergraduate institutions every single year. What I would say is compared to undergraduate admissions, the law school admissions process is a lot more stats oriented. And to that point, the best thing any undergraduate student can do for themselves is try to keep their GPA as high as possible. The reason that is because law schools are ranked based on the medians in part that they report. on a yearly basis. And when I say medians, I'm talking about the average LSAT they're admitting and the average GPA they're admitting. So when you are applying as an applicant, they're looking at you and maybe they absolutely love you, but then they're looking at your stats and they're like, oh, if we admit this girl, this, Danielle girl from Colombia, maybe both of her stats are underneath the medians. That's not going to be good for our medians, right? So ideally, you're above both of those average stats from the past year. However, if you're not, maybe you're above one, below the other. We call those splitters. Still a good place. Essays are going to play more of a role as well as work experience. It's really when you're below both where you get pretty shaky. So, to that point, if someone as an undergrad has to decide, am I going to be more involved on campus or am I going to focus on my GPA? I would pick the GPA every single time. LSAT can be retaken, but the second you graduate from college, that GPA is locked in stone. And the one other very important fact about stats for the law school admissions process is law schools care about their ranks so much that they're actually willing to offer these huge merit scholarships to students that have stats above both of those medians. So by having like a point or two more on the LSAT or a slightly higher GPA, you're setting yourself up for success to a point where you could be talking about like half ride to Columbia Law School versus nothing.
And I definitely believe, obviously, if you're going to a prestigious school like Harvard or Yale, and you want that, that's great. But if the financial impacts of going to law school is very important for you, then having a strong application would allow you perhaps to get even better financial aid package, essentially from like an NYU or another school that's a little bit further below the rankings, right?
Yes, and to that point, Harvard, Yale, and Stanford are the 3 law schools of all of them that do not offer merit aid in the admissions process, so, again, anything below that will, and you often have to make the difficult choice. Many of my peers had to make very difficult choices of whether Harvard was the right path with significantly less merit scholarship money than going to another school.
Right. Absolutely. Well, but if you get in, yeah, I think career-wise, I'm sure for many people, if they have the opportunity, like yourself, like others at Harvard, Yale, or Stanford Law, certainly, I think career-wise, they'll likely be very, at least okay in the long run.
One can hope.
Definitely. Well, let's talk a little bit more about, as people go into the future, this cycle of college admissions is pretty much wrapped up. Let's say 2025, for students that are applying for university, what should they really be doing in the next, let's say, 8 to 9 months to make their last year of high school more impactful?
So when I'm consulting juniors right now, I tell them that they should be focusing on a few different things. For one, junior year is just so, so important, grade wise, as well as just standardized test wise. So those should be your two main areas of focus. If you don't have the stats, again, you're just putting yourself in a place where it's going to be a harder case for any school to admit you. Beyond that, obviously looking to the junior year summer, you want to be thinking, okay, what can I do during the summer that is going to back up that major that I am applying with to try to make myself a particularly compelling applicant for my dream schools? I think it's always nice if you have the opportunity to tour a few schools because then you might be able to throw that in an essay as well. So most of the schools do have like a why us essay. So it's nice being able to say, as I strolled through campus and so on, whatever might have caught your eye or whatever particularly stood out to you during those moments. And then I think from there, it's really once you get to the summer, the common application, which is the platform you use to apply to the vast majority of colleges, they have kept their prompt basically the same for the main 650 word essay that you use to apply to various schools for years. So I usually have my students get started on that fairly early, usually in June, because then in July, you see that all of the other colleges start releasing their supplemental essays. So those are like the specific essays tailored to each individual school. And you want to be able to be almost done with that common application essay. So then you can start doing all the supplemental essays for the rest of the schools and preferably get them, in decent shape as you're going into senior year where you're not just scrambling as all the deadlines hit when you get to Thanksgiving break.
Right. Now, for college students who are writing their essays, something that's very big now in the last 2 years is, of course, ChatGPT. Here at where I am at HBS, professors and the academic departments are very cognizant of not utilizing ChatGPT to, of course, recognizing its inevitability, but stipulating its use to being, as a way to assist your writing, but not, of course, having it do your writing for you per se. And I'm sure there might be, you can maybe speak to the law school example requirements around that. But for aspiring high school students applying to college, what is your advice on the utilization of ChatGPT for kind of their application process?
Advise against the use of any AI or chat GPT. I think you never know on the admissions end what they're able to detect. And I also think that it's sometimes easy to figure out whether a high schooler has used chat GPT or not. I mean, for one, you can see someone's entire transcript of grades. And if you had maybe C's in English classes and then you're coming out with this very well done essay where it's like, where did this come from? Yeah, your guidance counselor might be getting a call. And is that really worth it to you to totally upend your entire admissions process? So I always have students work with me from the draft stage on, and we have never used ChatGPT for any of my students' essays. That's what I personally recommend. I don't think it's worth it, especially in an industry where, again, this is like a major process for people. You are defining your future. So, do you really want to risk that? What I will say from the law school end is law schools have varying perspectives on this. For the most part, you see admissions departments recommending against the use of chat gpt in essays, but for instance, I know ASU law actually is like, go for it. Don't ask me why. Apparently ASU per them is the most innovative school in the nation and they're trying to embrace the use of AI, but I just see most admissions departments at different schools going that way.
Definitely. Um, for parents of these students, perhaps now maybe their kids are a little bit younger, they're thinking about college. What would you recommend for the parents on next steps for preparing their students or their kids rather for preparing for college? So let's say their parents are thinking about, let's say their kids are just about to enter freshman year of high school. How should the parents think about their kids' future, and when should they perhaps, if they want to, bring in expertise, consultants, others to assist them with their kids?
I think regarding when to bring in experts, the earlier the better. As much as I don't meet with people as frequently when they're ninth grade on, many of the companies that I've worked with have those types of packages, and it's just nice to have someone to touch base with yet again who can tell you things just generally like, what are we thinking for major? Let's solidify that now. So again, we can build that narrative across 4 years versus you coming to me during senior year. And sure, at that point I can help you rework the essays and do what I can with what you've already been involved with, but it's just giving me less ability to really help in the maximum way I can.
And go ahead.
Factors that parents should consider, I would say, is obviously college is a big financial investment. And I often see families getting to senior year and then they're just going back and forth on like whether something like early decision works for them, because if you apply somewhere early decision, that does raise your chances of admission, but at the same time you might find yourself in a financial predicament because you're closing yourself off from financial aid at different schools. Usually there's less aid given during the early decision process, and you just don't know what that aid amount will be. And that might put a family in a difficult situation where they actually might even need to break the agreement. So I think it's just good to generally think about those things in advance. Like, what is our game plan going into senior year? What are we willing to support our child with or not?
That's definitely a very important point. College is getting more expensive than ever. Now it's, I think it used to be 50 to 60,000 a decade ago per year. Now it's in the range of, I think, 70 to 80,000 even for some places. So for each child that is going to college, that is, probably 350 to $400,000 investment. And for people that are, there was kids that are, in their, early teens, let's say middle school, even like, eventually college education could be a, 400,000 or $500,000 endeavor, which makes it more expensive than ever. How should parents be thinking about ways of perhaps understanding how they can get financial aid or how they can best help their kid, of course, afford a college education?
So most colleges actually have publicly available calculators on their websites that do show you the projected financial aid amount. So I always recommend that students and their families consult sources like that because those will be the best source of information regarding what a school would be willing to give. I think also you just want to be debating whether a private institution with the cost is worth it, right? There's a lot of fantastic public schools out there. I'm personally from California, so I had all the UCs in state. And obviously, the UCs for many people in California are going to be a lot cheaper than a school like Columbia. So it depends on your personal financial background and financial status, but there are a lot of great public schools out there, and you're not really putting yourself at a big disadvantage going to a school like Berkeley versus some of the other private institutions. So, again, this is just something families should generally be aware of and think out as they're deciding.
Absolutely. As we've talked a little bit about a few of the examples, could you perhaps give a few examples from the hundreds of clients that you've helped where maybe a kid has not been as well along their path for college, but you've been able to perhaps help them turn things around and end up going to a great university? Like, what did the kid need to do in a certain situation that, speaking anonymously, but like perhaps some examples of what you've been able to do very successfully as a college admissions consultant to kind of help parents essentially get their kids a better future.
I think that you most often see situations like that when, again, they come to you later on in the college admissions process. So I often have students who, through companies, are paired with me during senior year fall, and they come to me with their essays, and maybe the deadline for these colleges is in 2 to 3 weeks. And I start reading through the essays, and I'm like, okay, these topics are red flags. There are just unfortunately certain topics you should not be talking to admissions officers about, right? That could be like underage drinking. That could be, unfortunately, mental health is a very stigmatized topic in the admissions process. That could be something like that. But
Mm,
generally, just one thought you want to have as someone applying is, okay, am I showing myself off in a positive way? Like, will an admissions officer read this and think of me as a positive addition to the class? Or I always say, look at this from, you know, a very critical perspective. Will they see this essay and think, oh, actually, this student raises some concerns for me? Do I really want them at my institution? So I think often I do have students coming in with essays like that as seniors going through the admissions process. I did have a student come to me earlier this year where that was the case, and I just took one glance at this common application essay that actually had been approved by the school itself. Someone at the school thought it was a good idea, and I just took one look and I'm like, this is, I feel terrible having you rewrite this, but we cannot let you submit this. Actually, great timing for this podcast. This morning, he messaged me after we totally reworked the essay, shifted the topic entirely, saying that he was accepted to his top choice early decision. But I fully have to say, I do not think that would have happened with topic one. And to that point, I even checked with other people at the company I work for, and they were
Mhm.
like, this is not going to happen. You're absolutely right. We have no idea who led this student on this path in the first place.
Got it. Well, that's a great example of success. And as you've mentioned, you worked with a few companies over the last 8 years since you started. What's the landscape like for college admissions as, a kind of a endeavor for a lot of people? It's an entire industry. What are good companies? What are bad companies? What would make somebody, a really helpful college admissions consultant versus somebody who might not be as much?
I would say that the college admissions landscape is growing increasingly saturated. And it's been really interesting to see because, as you mentioned, it is a whole industry in itself. And to that point, one of the companies that I've predominantly worked for, we have over $10 million in venture capital funding as a college admissions company, right? And to that point, another company I haven't worked with, it's called Crimson Education. They have just made so much money in investments from different venture capital companies. I think that there's a few predominant companies, and some of them do have better offerings than others. Something I really like about one of the companies that I've worked for, and I'm trying not to give names because I'm not appearing here in an official capacity, but one of the companies that I've predominantly worked for, they actually have a score that shows you how qualified you are for different institutions based on your extracurriculars, your essays, and so on.
Hmm.
Beyond that, there's an essay editorial portal through which you can actually submit essays at any time of day, and they go through to a member of our essay editorial team, and you get a response in less than 24 hours with curated feedback. And you can do that as many times as you want until you run out of words in your package. We also have a research team where you can immediately ask any question about the college admissions process, whether that be give me a list of scholarships, give me a list of summer programs, give me a list of potential research opportunities I can pursue as a STEM student. And again, we have someone that specifically looks into that as well. So there's bigger players in the space that are offering more curated, specific offerings like that. And then at the same time, you're seeing like standalone college consultants who are just going on their own. There's maybe a few people at the company, and I think you can't go wrong either way. It's really just about finding a good fit. Sometimes it's nice having those additional resources I mentioned. I really think, as someone who has worked as a consultant for a company like that, it's been very helpful to me to have all these different layers. So, as much as I'm helping the student every step of the way, there's also others that are taking a second look. And I think that never hurts. But
No, it's very true. I guess how can people when they're thinking about like for themselves, for their kids, what can parents do leading up to perhaps, like high school itself? What can they do to best allow their kids for success? What are good strategies for parents to better prepare their kids as well?
I think that it's really about providing a supportive environment in which your student feels that they can be successful, whether that mean making sure that they have a good fit in a high school, because I've seen multiple students I've worked with had to transfer high schools during the admissions process or before that, just because they were at a high school that wasn't a good fit. So that's something just to be cognizant of as you're debating where to send your child to school. Beyond that, I think it's just setting them up for success, whether that means maybe finding a tutor for a class they might struggle in, but at the same time, being realistic about what the student's limits are, because you can throw your child into a million AP classes just because that's what colleges ideally might want. But then if they're not able to keep up and if they're overwhelmed and they have lower scores in those classes, that's going to reflect on them worse in the end than if they had like a mix of AP classes and regular classes. So it's really about knowing your own child's limits and what is their ideal mix of classes and coursework to set them up on that path of success.
Definitely. And there's increasingly, I think, in the last 2 years for students themselves of taking a gap year between college or high school and college or applying perhaps a little bit later in the cycle. Do you see that as a common thing? If people do that, why they do that and why that might make them competitive?
I've seen a few instances of that, but to be honest, most instances of that I see are
Hmm.
one, because of COVID, which hopefully we're out of that era for now, or two, it's because they actually applied once and they weren't happy with their results. So
Mm,
I know a few instances of that where students then took another year, reapplied. I don't think colleges are expecting that in the slightest. I don't think it's really a make or break for your application or not. I have known a few successful instances of that. For instance, I knew someone who was rejected from Columbia the first time around and then gained admission the second time. But
mhm.
I would really encourage that students put their best foot forward during their first attempt as seniors and at least see where it goes. And obviously, if you're not happy with your results and you do want to give yourself that second chance not to have regrets, that works as well.
Definitely. As we're kind of nearing the end of the podcast, how can people best find you? If they're interested in this, how can they kind of figure out where they can reach out to you and what you can specifically do to perhaps help them?
So you can find me on LinkedIn. It's just my full name, Danielle Mikaelian, or you can reach me via email. It's just D Mikaelian, which is Mikaelian at jd25.law.harvard.edu. Sorry, Harvard gives us very long emails.
Yeah. Do you get to keep it after you graduate, or do they make like an alumni email? Because I don't think we keep ours.
I don't think we get to keep it after we graduate, but for now that works. Once my email is officially shut down, you can always reach me on my LinkedIn. That should still be
Yeah.
up.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for your time, Danielle. And hopefully, some students listening in or some parents thinking about it found this episode to be helpful. So, thank you all for the advice and insights you've given.
Thank you for having me. It was a pleasure.